The Interstellar Museum of Extinct Species was not exactly the kind of place you wanted to end up, but then again, Captain Thorne had never been one to play it safe. As her ship, the Misery, docked with all the grace of a drunken Snorlax, she couldn't help but think that fate must have a wicked sense of humor to land her here. "Welcome to the last stop before oblivion," she muttered, watching the spaceport's flickering neon sign that read, "Preserve the past, ignore the present." The irony wasn't lost on her. A museum dedicated to things that no longer existed, and in the grand scheme of things, didn't matter much anymore. Her first officer, Rick, a man whose optimism died long before Earth was at risk of joining the exhibits, gave a dry chuckle. "I suppose they figured we'd make a good addition to their collection." "Cheer up, Rick. Maybe they'll give us our own wing," Thorne replied, as she adjusted her worn captain's coat, the fabric a patchwork of repairs. The crew disembarked, greeted by a curator who looked like he had one foot in the grave and the other slipping on a banana peel. "Ah, Captain Thorne," he croaked, his voice as dusty as the exhibits he tended to. "Here for the Earth exhibit cataloging, are we?" "That's the plan," Thorne said, trying not to breathe too deeply. He smelled like mothballs and regret. The curator led them through hallways filled with glass cases, each housing a sad reminder of what once was. Dodos, dragons, and the occasional Kardashian, all extinct, preserved for the universe to gawk at. "Lovely place you've got," Thorne said, glancing at a particularly gruesome diorama of a T-Rex in mid-roar. "Real homey," Rick grunted. "I'd rather be at a dentist's convention." The curator ignored their banter, probably used to the gallows humor of those who visited. "We're particularly interested in Earth's potential extinction scenario." "Potential?" Thorne scoffed. "I thought we were VIP, or should I say those doomed of Earth." The curator's thin lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Your world has been selected as a future battleground." Rick looked up, eyebrows raised. "Ah, the old intergalactic punching bag routine, always a hit." Thorne crossed her arms, her amusement fading. "Why Earth? Don't we have enough problems without adding Cosmic Warzone to the list?" "Precisely why you're here, Captain," the curator said, leading them into a room that resembled a war room, except the walls were lined with holographic maps of Earth. "The Galactic Council believes that Earth's current trajectory makes it an ideal location for conflict resolution." "Conflict resolution," Thorne echoed, incredulous. "Sounds more like collateral damage." Rick let out a low whistle. "Imagine that. Earth, the universe's premier fight club. First rule, don't talk about it because, well, you'll be too dead to do so." The curator continued, oblivious to their sarcasm. "Your task is to catalog Earth's potential for extinction, determine key species, and assess any worth in preservation." "Ah, so we're like cosmic archaeologists," Thorne said. "Dig up some bones, decide if they are worth saving." "Precisely," the curator nodded. "Though I would recommend a more professional approach." Thorne smirked. "Professional in this outfit?" "You're barking up the wrong tree, pal." The curator eyed her with the kind of disdain reserved for particularly stubborn stains. "Your crew has been selected for their particular resiliences." Translation: "We're the only ones stupid enough to take the job," Rick muttered. They were shown to their workspace, a cramped room with a few flickering screens and a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't worked since the last galactic recession. Thorne took it in stride, plopping down in a chair that groaned under the weight of its own existence. "Here's the deal, folks," she said, addressing her crew. "We figure out how Earth ends, write a neat little report, and if we're lucky, maybe we save a few species from the cosmic dumpster." Rick raised a hand. "Can we at least get some hazard pay for this?" "Sure," Thorne replied with a smirk. "You can have all the museum gift shop coupons you can carry." As the crew got to work, sifting through data, drinking questionable coffee, Thorne pondered the absurdity of it all. Earth as a battleground, humanity as a footnote in the annals of the universe. "Got a list here," said Jax, the ship's engineer, a man so cynical he made dry toast look moist. "Top species worth saving: dogs, cats, and cockroaches." Cockroaches? Rick asked, raising an eyebrow. Resilient little bastards, Jax replied. Survive anything like taxes, Thorn chuckled. Well, let's hope we can add humans to that list. As they continued to catalog Earth's various doomsday scenarios, climate change, nuclear war, and ill-timed Kardashian comeback, it became clear that humanity's odds weren't looking great. Why do they even bother with this? Rick wondered aloud, scrolling through the endless data. Beats me, Thorn said. Maybe because we're like ants to them. Step on a few, no one notices, Rick sighed. I always thought we'd go out with more of a bang. Cheer up, Rick, Thorn said with a smirk. There's always a chance we'll mess up so bad we'll make history as the species that couldn't even go extinct properly. Now there's a legacy, Rick replied. Despite the grim task, there was a strange comfort in the familiarity of the chaos. The crew bickered, drank what they courageously called coffee, and tried to make sense of the mess they'd been handed. Hours passed in a blur of sarcasm and dark humor, the crew's spirits buoyed by the absurdity of their mission. And then, just as Thorn was considering renaming the ship to the futility, something caught her eye. On one of the screens, a new report flickered to life. Galactic Council's Plan Earth, central site for diplomatic conflict resolution. Oh, you've got to be kidding, she said, leaning closer. Diplomatic conflict resolution by turning Earth into a war zone. Rick peeked over her shoulder. Talk about thinking outside the box. Or inside the coffin, Jax added, ever the optimist. Thorn rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the universe's worst decisions pressing down. So, we're not just cataloging extinction. We're planning the guest list for a party that ends with Earth as the cake. The crew fell silent, each of them contemplating the absurdity, the danger, and most importantly, the sheer idiocy of it all. But in the silence, there was also a resolve. If Earth was going to be the universe's playground, then they'd make sure humanity left a mark, a big, messy, irreverent mark. All right, Thorn said, rolling up her sleeves. Let's show the universe why humanity's too stubborn to go extinct without a fight. Rick nodded. If we're going down, let's at least go down swinging. The crew of the Misery grinned, a motley crew in the face of cosmic absurdity, ready to tackle the impossible with nothing but their wits, their sarcasm, and a questionable amount of coffee. As they set to work, Thorn glanced at the flickering screens, the data, the holograms of Earth. Maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to turn this cosmic joke around. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was turning disasters into opportunities, usually by accident. With a determined smirk, Thorn declared, "Let's rewrite the script, folks. Time to show them what extinct really means." As the crew of the Misery settled into their so-called workspace, Captain Thorn couldn't help but marvel at how the universe always seemed to find new and inventive ways to royally screw everyone over. Using Earth as a battleground for alien disputes. It was like picking your least favorite nephew's backyard for a family arm wrestling contest. The kind where nobody wins, but everyone leaves with a black eye. All right, Thorn said, clapping her hands to get the crew's attention. We've got a front row seat to the universe's dumbest idea yet. And the best part, we get to decide whether to jump into the ring or sit back and enjoy the carnage. Rick leaned against the flickering console, an expression of skepticism etched on his weathered face. I vote for sitting back, preferably with a drink in hand, watching the fireworks from a safe distance, preferably a few galaxies away. Seconded, Jax chimed in, fiddling with an ancient coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed. You ever try doing a job with a bullseye on your back? It's overrated. But Thorn wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily, and miss out on the chance to play hero. Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Rick snorted. Stuck in the last bar we visited, probably still nursing a hangover. The room erupted with laughter, the kind that hides the fear simmering beneath. Because they all knew the stakes. Messing with the Galactic Council was a surefire way to end up as a footnote in some alien historian's textbook, and not one of those interesting footnotes either. Look, Thorn continued, I'm not saying we charge in guns blazing, but we need to decide if we're going to let the cosmos treat Earth like the universe's punching bag or do something about it. Do something about it, Jax echoed, raising an eyebrow as he finally coaxed a cup of sludge from the coffee maker. Like what? Send a sternly worded memo. Dear Galactic Council, please don't obliterate my home planet. Yeah, that'll work. Maybe not a memo, Thorn conceded, but we can't just sit on our hands either. And why not? Rick asked, folding his arms. It's gotten us this far. Thorn looked around at her crew, her ragtag band of misfits and smartasses. They might have been the bottom of the cosmic barrel, but they were her bottom of the barrel. And if there was one thing they were good at, it was surviving against the odds, mostly by accident, but still. Because, she said, if we don't at least try, who the hell will? Besides, think of the stories we could tell. Remember the time we saved Earth from becoming the intergalactic Thunderdome? Rick shrugged. I prefer remember the time we didn't die horribly in an alien firefight. Jax chuckled, raising his cup of questionable coffee in salute. I'll drink to that. They all chuckled, the laughter tinged with the kind of desperation that comes when you're staring down the barrel of a ridiculously bad idea and considering pulling the trigger just to see what happens. All right, let's say we decide to stick our noses in where they don't belong, Jax said, glancing at Thorn. What's the plan, Captain? Thorn sank into a chair that squeaked under protest, pondering the question. First, we figure out what the Council and their alien buddies have planned for Earth. If we're lucky, maybe we can throw a wrench in the works. Or we get ground into dust by a horde of angry aliens, Rick added helpfully. Details, Thorn said with a wave of her hand. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The crew glanced at each other, a silent agreement passing between them. They were in this together for better or worse, likely worse if their track record was anything to go by. So, reconnaissance then, Rick said, sitting up straighter. Figure out what we're dealing with and how deep the Council's interests go. Thorn nodded. And maybe, just maybe, we find a way to keep Earth from becoming a crater. Or at least delay it long enough for us to get the hell out of Dodge, Jax muttered. With a plan, albeit a half-baked one, in place, the crew turned their attention to the task at hand, uncovering the Galactic Council's intentions without ending up as exhibit A in the museum's newest tragic heroes section. Rick and Jax busied themselves with tapping into the museum's security feeds, hoping to glean any useful information from the whispers of the Council's emissaries. Meanwhile, Thorn scoured the databases for any mention of Earth within the Council's archives, a digital treasure hunt with their lives as the stakes. Hours ticked by, the silence punctuated by muttered curses and the occasional clatter of malfunctioning equipment. The flickering screens cast an otherworldly glow over the crew's faces, shadows stretching like dark fingers across the walls. Got something, Rick announced, breaking the tense silence. He pointed to a feed showing a small delegation of aliens gathered in a conference room, their strange, chitinous forms clustered around a central holographic display. Thorn and Jax crowded around the console, watching the playback with grim fascination. The aliens spoke in low, guttural tones, their conversation punctuated by the occasional click and hiss. The hologram flickered with images of Earth, marked with colorful strategic icons. That's one hell of a battle plan, Jax observed, his voice low. Looks like they're planning to divvy up the planet like a kid with a cake. And we're the sprinkles, Thorn muttered, her eyes narrowing. Look at those troop movements. They're not just planning a skirmish. This is an all-out invasion. Rick leaned closer, his brow furrowed with concern. We need to get this information to someone who can actually do something about it. Someone with more firepower than a rusty bolt-action and a bag of ill intentions. Who? Jax asked. Most of Earth's leaders would sell their own mothers for a chance at a better hand in this cosmic poker game. We need someone we can trust. Someone who won't stab us in the back the moment we hand over the intel, Rick added. Thorn considered their options, a grim determination settling over her features. We're not handing this over to anyone, not yet. Not until we know exactly who we're dealing with and what they stand to gain. And how do you propose we do that? Rick asked, skepticism dripping from his voice. Thorne grinned, a flash of mischief lighting her eyes. We get them talking. Find a way to crash their little party and see what else they let slip. Crash their party, Jax echoed, incredulous. Captain, that's suicide. They'll see us coming from a mile away. Maybe, Thorne conceded, but we've got one advantage they don't. Rick raised an eyebrow. What's that? We're the last people they'd expect to pull something this insane, Thorne said. They think we're just another crew of nobodies. Let's use that to our advantage. Despite the looming threat, a sense of camaraderie settled over the crew. This was their fight now, not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was their chance to matter. To leave their mark on the universe, even if it was a smudge on an otherwise pristine record. So what's the plan? Jax asked, a touch of excitement in his voice now. Thorne leaned back, her mind racing with possibilities. We infiltrate the museum's gala, get close enough to eavesdrop on the council's delegation and figure out what they are really after. Just like that, huh? Rick said, chuckling. Throw on a suit, blend in with the crowd, and walk away with the alien equivalent of state secrets. Exactly, Thorne replied, unfazed. And if anyone asks, we're here to negotiate Earth's surrender terms, Jax snorted. Yeah, because that won't raise any eyebrows. Maybe, Thorne said, but it beats sitting around and waiting to become part of the museum's collection. And with that, the crew of the Misery set to work, each of them driven by the knowledge that this might be their only chance to change the course of history. Not just for Earth, but for themselves. Because sometimes, the only way to survive was to laugh in the face of danger and run headlong into the fire, hoping you'd find a way out on the other side. The gala was set to take place the next night, giving the crew precious little time to prepare. As they worked, tensions ran high, but so did humor, dark and biting as always. Rick, poring over the logistics, shook his head. You know, this might be the dumbest thing we've ever done. That's saying something, Jax replied, soldering the circuits for a jury-rigged eavesdropping device. Thorne surveyed her crew, a motley collection of individuals who'd somehow become her family. They had no business trying to save the world. But then again, maybe that's exactly what the world needed, a group of misfits with nothing to lose and everything to gain. I won't lie, Thorne said, addressing them. This is risky. We'd be going up against forces we barely understand with no guarantee of success. Rick shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. And it won't be the last, Jax added with a grin. Thorne nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and trepidation. Then let's do this. Failure isn't an option because it's the only one we already know and hate. With a renewed sense of purpose, the crew finalized their preparations, each task a step closer to defying the odds stacked against them. And as the hours ticked away, the weight of their decision settled over them, heavy but not unwelcome. Because in the end, what choice did they really have? They were the crew of the Misery, the last, best hope for a world teetering on the brink of oblivion. And they'd be damned if they let that world fall without a fight. The Interstellar Museum of Extinct Species buzzed with an odd mix of excitement and dread, like an anthill that knew it was about to be stepped on. The annual gala was the kind of event where those with power mingled with those with even more power, and everyone pretended not to notice the silent game of who could stab who in the back the fastest. For Captain Thorne and her crew, it was just another Tuesday. As the crew of the Misery made their final preparations for their Crash the Gala plan, Rick tried his best to make sense of the museum's outdated communication systems. The ancient tech was more stubborn than a bureaucrat on a coffee break, and just as useful. No dice, Rick muttered, frowning at the console like it had just insulted his mother. We're not getting any signals through. It's like trying to shout across the vacuum of space. Of course it is, Jax replied, lounging in a chair that looked like it had seen better centuries. Why would anything work when you actually need it to? That'd be too easy. Thorne rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar tension headache that came with being in charge of a group of people who had very little regard for authority, even hers. So we've got no way to warn Earth about the ongoing alien musical chairs game. Fantastic. Rick sighed, running a hand over the worn controls. Looks like someone's jamming us, or the museum's tech is older than the fossils they display. Either way, we're cut off. Wonderful, Thorne said, sarcasm dripping from her words like oil from a cheap engine. Just what we needed. An unknown enemy with a sense of humor. We're being watched, Rick added. I can feel it, like that time on Principia 5 when the locals kept staring at us like we were the main course. Maybe it's the way you stare back, Jax quipped, fiddling with an earpiece that refused to stay in place. Or maybe they just don't get a lot of visitors with our level of charm. Ha, charm. That's what we're calling it now, Rick shot back, rolling his eyes. Thorne cut them off, her voice firm. Focus, people, we're not getting a signal out, but that doesn't mean we're out of options. We still have the gala. And what exactly are we supposed to do there? Rick asked, skeptical. Simple, Thorne said. We mingle, we listen, and when the time's right, we make our move. Someone in that room knows what's going on, and we're going to find out who, Jack snorted. Sounds like a plan. A terrible, half-baked plan, but a plan nonetheless. Best kind, Thorne replied with a wry smile. Now get your game faces on. We've got a party to crash. As they made their way towards the gala, the crew couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The corridors of the museum stretched out before them like veins in some ancient spacefaring beast, whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. Or maybe it was the wind. Hard to tell in space. Anyone else feel like we're walking into a trap? Jax asked, adjusting the collar of his borrowed suit. It fit him like a glove, if the glove had been made for a tentacle monster. It's either that or we're just paranoid, Rick replied, glancing over his shoulder for the umpteenth time. Paranoid, Thorne mused, is just another word for prepared, or so I've heard. They arrived at the entrance to the gala, and the door slid open with a hiss that sounded suspiciously like a sigh of resignation. Inside, the room was a swirling mess of sound and color, a cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of music that made you wonder if the musicians had ever actually heard a tune before. Ah, high society, Jack said, grinning, where the drinks are free and the conversation's expensive. Rick smirked. And everyone's trying to see who can out-pompous who with the least amount of effort. Thorne led the way, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent far too long maneuvering through chaos. Remember, we're here to listen. Eyes and ears open, mouths shut. As if that'll happen, Rick said under his breath, earning a nudge from Jax. The crew split up, each of them taking a section of the room to subtly eavesdrop on conversations. Jax sidled up to a group of aliens who looked like they'd just come from a funeral or a fashion show, hard to tell in space. Rick found himself cornered by a delegate who seemed intent on discussing the finer points of interstellar taxation, a subject only slightly less interesting than watching paint dry. Thorne, meanwhile, drifted between clusters of attendees, her ears picking up snippets of conversation about troop movements, strategic alliances, and the odd joke about human ineptitude. It was amazing how people tended to underestimate the species that invented pizza. As the evening wore on, Thorne's attention was drawn to a group near the center of the room. They were gathered around a holographic display, much like the one they'd seen earlier, their expressions a mix of excitement and something else, something darker. She edged closer, careful to remain inconspicuous. The conversation was in a language she didn't recognize, but the expressions on their faces spoke volumes. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to end well for Earth. Got something? Jax appeared at her elbow, his voice low enough to blend into the background noise. Maybe, Thorne said, keeping her gaze on the group, but I can't make out the details. We need a translator, Jax suggested. And a miracle, Rick said, joining them with a bemused expression. Apparently, Earth's been written off by some as a lost cause. Nice of them to decide that for us. Thorne frowned. We'll see about that. For now, we stick to the plan and hope something useful falls into our laps. Hope, Jax smirked. That's a new one for us. Desperate times, Thorn replied. Now let's see if we can find out more before the evening's over. As they reconvened near the bar, a place of comfort and anonymity in any galaxy, they swapped stories of their individual encounters. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest that Earth's fate was being decided without its input. Any bright ideas? Rick asked, drumming his fingers on the counter. Yeah, Thorn said, her mind working overtime. We need to get closer, see if we can access their systems directly. You're talking about hacking the museum's network during a gala, Jax pointed out. Subtlety's never been our strong suit. Then it's time to learn, Thorn said, her eyes glinting with determination. We need that intel and we're running out of time. Rick sighed, glancing around at the oblivious crowd. All right, I'm in, but if we get caught, I'm blaming you. Naturally, Thorn said with a smirk. Let's get to it. They made their way to a quieter corner of the room, where the flickering lights cast long shadows against the walls. Rick set to work on accessing the museum's network, his fingers flying over the keys with a practiced ease. Jax kept watch, doing his best to look like he belonged in this kind of company. It wasn't exactly his natural habitat, but he managed to pull it off with a certain roguish charm. As Rick worked, Thorn's thoughts drifted to their situation. They were in over their heads, cut off from Earth, unable to communicate with the very people they were trying to save. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here they were, trying to prevent a calamity, and they'd ended up as powerless as the people they were trying to protect. Got it, Rick said, breaking her reverie. I'm in. Thorn leaned over his shoulder, watching as the console's screen filled with data. Nice work. Now let's see what they've been keeping from us. The information was a jumble of troop deployments, strategic plans, and enough acronyms to make a military strategist weep. But one thing was clear. The situation on Earth was worse than they'd thought. They're planning a full-scale invasion, Thorn said, her voice grim. And if this goes down, Earth's not going to stand a chance. Any allies mentioned? Jax asked, hopeful. Not the kind we want, Rick replied, scanning the data. Looks like Earth's been left to fend for itself. Thorn's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan from the scraps of information they had. They needed to get this intel to someone who could use it and fast, but with communications jammed, their options were limited. We need to find a way to break through the jamming, Thorn said, her mind working overtime. There's got to be a way. Short of a miracle, Rick asked, glancing up from the console. Short of a miracle, Thorn confirmed. But we don't have time to wait for one. Jax grinned, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Then let's make our own. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve that just might do the trick. Thorn raised an eyebrow. Care to share with the class? Not yet, Jax replied, already moving toward the exit. But trust me, it's going to be one hell of a show. As they left the gala, Thorn couldn't shake the feeling that their every move was being watched, but they couldn't afford to be cautious. Earth's fate hung in the balance, and they were the only ones who could do anything about it. With their newfound intel and the clock ticking down, the crew of the Misery set out to do the impossible. To break through the jamming, get the information to Earth, and somehow, against all odds, save the day. Because if there was one thing they were good at, it was defying expectations. And if there was one thing they needed right now, it was a miracle. Or at least the next best thing. A crew of misfits with a penchant for pulling off the improbable. As they returned to the Misery, the weight of their mission settled over them. Failure was not an option and the stakes had never been higher. But they were ready. Ready to fight. Ready to laugh in the face of danger. Ready to do whatever it took to save Earth from becoming another footnote in the museum's collection. And as they prepared for the final stretch of their reckless, insane plan, one thought lingered in Thorn's mind. If this was their last stand, at least they'd go down swinging. The Misery felt like it might fall apart any second, but that was part of its charm. Like an old drinking buddy who still had a few stories left to tell, even if those stories were mostly about liver failure. Captain Thorn slumped in the pilot's chair, massaging the tension headache that had set up camp behind her eyes. The gala had been a bust, but hey, It wasn't like they had an invasion to stop, right? So how do we break into a museum's archives during what, I'm guessing, is their off hours? Rick asked, his fingers still twitching from the data hack. Preferably without getting ourselves added to the exhibit of extinct species. Easy, Thorne replied, injecting more confidence into her voice than she felt. We do it with style, finesse, and a complete lack of planning. Jax chuckled, lounging in his seat like a smug cat with a plan. Isn't that our standard operating procedure, except for the style and finesse parts? I vote we skip the finesse and just hope for dumb luck, Rick said, tapping at his console. I've got the museum's blueprints here. Looks like they keep the archives on the lower level. Security's tight but not impossible. Great, Thorne said. We'll be in and out before they even notice. Yeah, in and out, Jax echoed, raising an eyebrow. And if not, we can always claim we got lost looking for the gift shop. Thorne nodded. Rick, can you rig something to get us past the security system? Sure, if by rig you mean pray and guess. The tech in this museum is older than the fossils they display. But first, I need to finish bypassing their network without blowing up the ship. Or us. Good plan, Thorne said with a wicked grin. I've grown attached to not being dead. The Misery shuddered as it awkwardly docked at the museum's auxiliary bay, a spot so abandoned it could give hermits lessons. The docking clamps groaned like an old man getting out of bed, but they held. All right, let's move, Thorne ordered, swinging out of her seat with the grace of a cat landing on a slippery table. The night's not getting any younger, and neither are we. They disembarked, creeping through the quiet corridors with the kind of stealth that only comes from absolute desperation. Thorne led the way, her footsteps echoing ominously, as if the museum itself was sniggering at their pathetic attempt at subterfuge. They reached the archive room, its door looming like an ironclad promise of impending doom. Rick crouched by the access panel, his fingers flying over the controls. This'll take a minute. I'm good, but I'm not magic. Just as well, Jax muttered. If you were magic, we'd have to start believing in miracles. And none of us have time for that kind of existential crisis. With a final flick of his wrist, Rick pulled back, grinning like he'd just beaten a particularly smug chess opponent. We're in. Great, Thorne said. Let's see what secrets these fossils have been hiding. Inside, the archive room was a treasure trove of dusty relics and forgotten knowledge. Holographic displays flickered to life, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters over the walls. Thorne scanned the room, her gaze settling on a central console that looked like it could hold the secrets of the universe, or at least a decent distraction. Let me give it a shot, Thorne said, and with a sideways glance at Rick, she added, you can backseat drive if I mess up. No need to tell me twice, Rick replied, hovering over her shoulder like an overbearing parent at a talent show. Thorne tapped commands into the console, her brow furrowed in concentration. Data streamed across the screen, a jumble of coordinates, troop movements, and bureaucratic nonsense that made her eyes cross. Anything useful? Jax asked, feigning interest as he inspected the room's collection of ancient Earth artifacts, a fine testament to humanity's knack for collecting junk. Possibly, Thorne said, brow still furrowed. Looks like there's some mention of the Galactic Council's weaknesses. This might be the break we need. Break, Rick said, smirking. More like a coffee break for them while we scramble to survive. Focus, Thorne said, though the irony of her own lack of focus wasn't lost on her. If we can exploit this, we might have a shot at stopping the invasion. Jax, who'd been idly turning a dusty globe, paused. And how do we do that without getting our heads mounted on the wall as a cautionary tale? Simple, Thorne said, her voice laced with sarcasm. We go back, formulate a plan that doesn't involve dying, and hope the council doesn't catch wind of it before we're done. Rick scrolled through the files, his eyes narrowing. They're jamming our signals from multiple locations. To break through, we'd need to disable their stations one by one. Great, Jax said, tossing the globe and catching it with a lazy grace. So, a suicide mission, basically. Thorne rolled her eyes. Would it kill you to be a little more optimistic? Probably, Jax replied. Optimism tends to get people killed. Look at history. Speaking of history, Rick said, pointing at the console, if we can take out those jamming stations, we might be able to send a message back to Earth, and hope they're still listening, Jax added. Thorn pushed away from the console, her mind racing. All right, we've got our work cut out for us. Let's get this data back to the Misery and figure out our next move, and try not to get caught. I'd rather not end up as an exhibit, thank you. They retraced their steps, slipping through the museum's haunted halls with the kind of stealth one gets from years of sneaking out of awkward social gatherings. As they approached the Misery, the weight of their mission pressed down on them, a reminder that failure wasn't just an option, it was the most likely outcome. But as they boarded the ship, Jax turned to Thorn, a wry smile playing on his lips. You know, for a crew that's terrible at following rules, we've made it this far without getting killed. That's got to count for something, right? Thorn laughed, a short, sharp bark that spoke of frayed nerves and too little sleep. Yeah, it counts for sheer dumb luck. But I'll take it. As they settled back into the Misery's cramped confines, Thorn felt the ship shudder beneath her feet, a reminder that time was running out. They needed to break the jamming, get their message through, and stop an invasion, all before the universe decided they were more trouble than they were worth. All right, team, Thorn said, her voice firm, despite the low-level panic buzzing in her skull. Let's see if we can pull off the impossible. Rick nodded, his fingers already flying over the console. I'll start working on the signal. Jax, you're on lookout. Make sure no one slips up on us while we're distracted. Got it, Jax said, moving to the viewport with the air of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. As they worked, Thorn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to fail. But failure wasn't an option, not when Earth was counting on them, whether Earth knew it or not. Hey Thorn, Rick said, breaking the silence. What's our backup plan if this doesn't work? Thorn paused, considering. We don't have one, she admitted, a grim smile tugging at her lips. But if it comes to it, we'll improvise. We've been doing that our whole lives. Why stop now? Jax snorted. That's the spirit. We'll just wing it and hope for the best. Maybe we'll even get our own exhibit if we survive this. Sounds like a plan, Rick said, though his tone suggested he thought it was anything but. All right, let's see if we can make some history. As they worked, the ship hummed around them, a reminder of the steady, unrelenting passage of time. They were racing against the clock, against enemies they couldn't see but could definitely feel breathing down their necks. It was a dangerous game, one they weren't even sure they could win, but it was the only game they had. And as they pulled together, their makeshift family of misfits and rogues, Thorn knew that whatever happened, they'd go down fighting, because that's what they did best. The Misery's cargo hold had seen better days. Hell, it had probably seen better centuries. Rust crept along the metal walls like an ambitious fungus. The air smelled like a combination of burnt coffee and despair, and the light fixtures flickered as though they were unsure if they wanted to continue being part of this universe or not. Thorn, Rick, and Jax stood amidst the chaos, poring over the data they just ripped from the museum's archives. So, we're not dead. Yet, Rick said, scratching the back of his head where his helmet had left an impressive case of hat hair. That's the good news. Right, Jax said, poking at a suspicious-looking stain on the floor with his boot. And the bad news is that we're about to walk headfirst into a death trap. But hey, at least we'll do it with our heads high and our dignity intact. Thorn snorted. Dignity? On this ship? Good one, Jax. Next you'll tell me this Rust Bucket's getting a spa day. Rick shifted uneasily, eyes flitting to the console. We should focus on the problem at hand, disabling the jamming stations. Without that, we're as good as ghosts out here. Jax leaned back, his arms crossed. And speaking of ghosts, when do you reckon the Galactic Council will notice we're poking around in their business? Thorn shrugged, her expression one of carefully curated indifference. Probably about the time they decide to make us the universe's new cautionary tale. Don't be like Thorn and her merry band of idiots. Great. Rick muttered. Our legacy will be educational. The console beeped as it processed the data, and Rick's fingers danced over the keys, extracting whatever useful information he could find. Okay, here's the skinny. The jamming stations are scattered, but the closest one's about an hour's flight from here. We might be able to take it out if we hurry. Might? Thorn said, eyebrow arching in a way that suggested skepticism had become her natural state. Yeah, might, Rick repeated. Unless, of course, you'd prefer we go full kamikaze and hope the universe doesn't notice our lack of wings. Optimist, Jack said dryly, though his eyes held a hint of mischief. All right, Captain, what's the plan? Or are we just gonna wing it as usual? Little bit of both, Thorn admitted. We'll head for the station and hope that we can disable it without getting blown to hell. Rick, you'll be on tech duty. Jax, keep an eye on the scanners. I want to know if anything decides to sneak up on us. Roger that, Jax nodded, settling into his seat with the air of someone who expected the universe to pull a fast one on them at any moment. The Misery creaked and groaned as it lifted off from the museum, its engines coughing like a smoker with a bad lung infection. Thorn guided the ship with the ease of someone who'd spent far too long in its cramped cockpit, her fingers moving over the controls with a practiced familiarity. As they flew, the silence between them grew heavy, weighted with the knowledge of what lay ahead. It wasn't just the mission that gnawed at them, but the unspoken understanding that they were teetering on the brink of disaster, held together by nothing more than sheer stubbornness and a touch of madness. Hey, Thorn, Rick broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. You ever think about what you'd be doing if you weren't out here risking your neck with us idiots? Thorn chuckled, the sound dry as desert sand. Yeah, all the time. I'd probably be a middle manager at some soul-sucking corporation, wondering why my life feels like a hollowed-out husk. Sounds cozy, Jax chimed in. I'd probably be doing the same thing, except I'd be the one stealing office supplies and blaming it on the interns. Remind me never to hire you, Rick said, shaking his head. You'd bankrupt me in a week. The banter was comfortable, a lifeline thrown between the three of them as they hurtled through the void of space. But comfort had to be balanced with the ever-present tension that thrummed through the ship like a living thing, a reminder that they were on borrowed time. Approaching the jamming station, Jax announced, his voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. Looks like it's guarded, though. Some ships on patrol, they don't look friendly. Thorn's lips curled into a thin line. We're not here to make friends, Jax. Rick, can you get us in close enough to disable it without triggering every alarm in the galaxy? Rick tapped at his console, a frown etched into his features. Maybe. If we come in low, use the station itself as cover, but if they catch us, we're screwed. Story of our lives, Jax quipped. The Misery slid through space like a shadow, hugging the contours of the jamming station as if it were an old lover. The patrol ships loomed just outside their sensors, a reminder of the ever-present danger that stalked them like a persistent creditor. Almost there, Rick said, his voice taut with concentration. Just a little closer, and then it all went to hell. The Misery shuddered violently as an alarm blared through the cabin, lights flashing red in a chaotic dance of imminent danger. They'd been spotted. Shit, Thorn yelled, her hands flying over the controls as she tried to stabilize the ship. They're onto us. Incoming fire, Jax shouted, his hands gripping the edges of his console as the ship rocked with the impact. Rick worked frantically, his fingers moving faster than seemed humanly possible. I'm trying to disable the station, but they've locked onto us. Thorn's mind raced, weighing their options, each one worse than the last. Can we outrun them? Not in this junker, Jax replied, his voice a mixture of frustration and resignation. We're sitting ducks. Then we fight, Thorn decided, her tone brooking no argument. Rick, disable that station. Jax and I will keep them off us as long as we can. Rick nodded, sweat beading on his forehead as he focused all his attention on the console. The ship bucked beneath them, the sound of blaster fire echoing through the hull, but Rick blocked it all out, his world narrowing to the task at hand. Got it, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. The station's disabled. Time to hightail it out of here, Thorn said, wrenching the controls to break away from the station. The Misery shuddered, protesting against the abuse, but it obeyed, pulling them back into the relative safety of open space. But the victory was short-lived. One of the enemy ships had managed to close the distance, its weapons locked onto them with a deadly precision that spoke of an experienced pilot. "We're not gonna make it," Jax said, a grim resignation in his voice as the ship's shields flickered and failed under the onslaught. "Maybe not," Thorn replied, eyes narrowed as she prepared for the inevitable. "But we're sure as hell gonna try." Just then an explosion rocked the ship, throwing them into chaos. The alarms blared with renewed urgency as systems failed, and the cabin filled with acrid smoke. "Status," Thorn demanded, coughing against the harshness in her throat. "Not good," Rick said, his voice laced with panic. "We've lost engines." "We're dead in space." Jax's eyes locked onto Thorn's, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them. They were out of options, out of time, and out of luck. "We need to abandon ship," Thorn ordered, her voice steady despite the storm raging around them. "Grab what you can and head for the escape pods." Rick hesitated, his gaze flicking between Thorn and the console. "But the data," "Screw the data," Thorn snapped. "We can't use it if we're dead." The three of them scrambled through the chaos, grabbing whatever essentials they could carry as the ship continued to shudder and scream around them. The familiar corridors that had once felt like home now loomed like the hallways of a sinking ship, every step a reminder of their impending doom. They reached the escape pods, breathless and bruised, their movements desperate and frantic. Thorn punched the release, the door hissing open with a finality that echoed through the cabin. "Go," Thorn shouted, pushing Rick and Jax into the pod. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." Rick's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a determination in them that spoke of a man who knew he had no choice. "You better follow us, Thorn, or I'll haunt your ass." "Yeah," Jax added, his usual levity gone, replaced by a grim resolve. "We're not losing you, Cap." With a nod, Thorn sealed them inside, watching as the pod launched away from the ship. Alone now, she turned back to the controls, her fingers flying as she rerouted power, trying to buy them whatever time she could. The enemy ship closed in, its weapons charging for the final blow. Thorn took a breath, her mind racing with 100 thoughts, each one a possibility of how she might see them through this impossible situation. "All right, Misery," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "Let's see if you've got one last trick up your sleeve." She punched the console, rerouting what little power remained to the ship's engines. The Misery surged forward, a burst of speed that caught the enemy off guard, its weapons firing wide as it struggled to adjust its aim. But the victory was short-lived. Another hit, and the ship shuddered violently, the lights flickering once, twice, before plunging into darkness. For a moment there was silence, a stillness that stretched out in the void, and Thorn found herself floating in a sea of stars, her mind caught between the reality of her situation and the stubborn refusal to accept it. The Misery was dying, but in its final moments it had given her one last gift, a chance for her crew to escape, to live another day and fight another battle. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The silence of space, if you could call it silence, was rudely interrupted by the incessant ringing inside Thorn's head. Not the pleasant sort of ringing like bells in a quiet hamlet, but the kind you get stuck with after a night of particularly poor decisions and even worse liquor. She was floating in the black, the aftermath of the Misery's brave but ultimately futile charge still echoing in her bones. Somewhere out there, Rick and Jax were tumbling through space in an escape pod, probably already betting which of them would puke first. Thorn had to admire their optimism. They'd escaped one disaster and had every confidence she'd rescue them from the next one. "Preserve the past, ignore the present," she muttered, that damned neon sign flashing in her mind. Well, she'd been doing a bang-up job ignoring the present, but now it was time to kick the past into gear. With just enough power left to tease the faintest glow from the control panel, Thorn flicked through her options. It was a menu of disaster, each choice somehow worse than the last, like deciding between paper cuts or a root canal. But she had an idea, a spark ignited by hours spent loitering in the museum's dusty halls, absorbing ancient human wisdom while the curator wasn't looking. She was going to pull off a Trojan horse maneuver, the old Greek trick. Except instead of a wooden horse, it was going to be the misery, her beloved heap of junk, smoldering and dead in the water. Nothing like a bit of classical strategy to make her feel like less of a screw-up. "All right, misery," she murmured. "Let's get this horse galloping." With the last dregs of power, Thorn rerouted emergency systems to transmit a distress signal, the digital equivalent of a white flag waving vigorously. If there was one thing you could count on out here, it was the obsessive curiosity of scavengers and opportunists. The ship's recent fireworks show would be a beacon to every cutthroat with a taste for salvage. Thorn strapped into the last remaining escape pod, the seatbelt cutting into her ribs. "You better hold, you rust bucket," she muttered, her voice rough against the pod's cramped acoustics. "Or we'll both be museum exhibits before you know it." As the pod ejected, she caught one last glimpse of the misery, floating like a ghost in the dark, its hull still smoking from the skirmish. It was a hell of a way to say goodbye, but they'd been through worse. Hopefully, they'd have a chance to be reacquainted when the universe wasn't trying to murder them. The pod's thrusters kicked in, sending her careening toward the coordinates she'd punched into the system. The ride was less than smooth, more like being tossed around in a washing machine with a grudge, but it would do. She had a destination, and by the stars she had a plan. Rick and Jax's escape pod was about as cozy as a tin can, and it smelled like one too. Rick, ever the optimist, was frantically scanning for any sign of their fearless leader. "Think she'll make it?" Jax asked, his tone casual, as if it were just another day in the office and not a life-threatening escape pod hurtling through space. "Thorn's got more lives than a cat," Rick said, tapping buttons with the precision of a disgruntled pianist. "Besides, she's too stubborn to die out here." Jax chuckled, his sardonic grin visible even in the dim light of the pod. "Yeah, that's Thorn for you. Wouldn't want to give the universe the satisfaction." The console beeped, drawing their attention. The signal was faint but unmistakable, the telltale sign of someone with the same terrible luck as theirs. "She's alive," Rick said, an uncharacteristic excitement edging his words. "And broadcasting a signal. Looks like she's got a plan." "Well, color me surprised," Jax replied. "Guess we better get ready to play our parts in whatever mad scheme she's cooked up." "Yeah, but first," Rick said, pulling out a battered pack of cards from his pocket. "Wanna play a round?" Jax rolled his eyes, but there was a warmth to it. "You really are a masochist, aren't you? All right, deal me in. Just don't cry when I beat you." The game was a welcome distraction, a brief moment of normalcy in the midst of chaos. But in the back of their minds, they were readying themselves for whatever Thorn had in store. As fate would have it, Thorn's distress signal attracted exactly the kind of company you'd expect, an opportunistic crew of scavengers, drawn like moths to a burning ship. The scavenger's vessel, the Rust Rat, sidled up to the misery, its crew eager to strip it down to bolts and dust. Hidden in the shadows of a nearby asteroid field, Thorn grinned, the kind of grin that usually preceded something ill-advised and potentially explosive. Her escape pod clung to the asteroid's surface, cloaked in its radar shadow. She had a front-row seat to the show, and she was ready to bring the house down. "All right, you rat bastards," she muttered, her fingers dancing over the pod's controls. "Let's see how you like a little fireworks." Inside the misery, the scavengers were already at work, their greedy hands prying open panels and rifling through the debris. They were too busy looting to notice the subtle hum, the gentle whir of a system rebooting. "Hey, Sykes," one of the scavengers called over the comms, his voice echoing through the gutted interior. "Looks like the ship's got some juice left. Must be our lucky day." "Well, strip it down before she wakes up," Sykes replied, his tone all business. "We don't want any surprises." But surprises were exactly what Thorn had in mind. She watched with satisfaction as the Misery's emergency systems flickered to life, her old friend playing its part in the ruse. The scavengers were so caught up in their haul that they'd missed the telltale signs of a tactical reboot. With a gentle nudge, Thorn activated the override she'd programmed, the Misery's defense system sparking back into action. The scavenger crew barely had a chance to react before the ship's automated turrets whirred to life, targeting the intruders with mechanical precision. "Shit, it's a trap!" one of the scavengers yelled, diving for cover as the turrets opened fire, the air filled with the hiss of lasers and the acrid smell of burning metal. Thorn watched the chaos unfold, her heart pounding with the thrill of it all. She knew the odds were still against her, but victory lay in the element of surprise, and she delivered it with interest. Using the commotion as cover, she guided her pod toward the Misery, the thrusters firing in short, controlled bursts. She had a narrow window to board the ship, to turn this battle in their favor. As the pod docked with the Misery, Thorn braced herself for the fight ahead, adrenaline singing through her veins. She'd made it this far on a wing and a prayer. Now it was time to see if she could pull off a miracle. Inside the ship, the scavengers were still reeling, caught between retreat and attack. Thorn burst from the pod, her blaster raised, and dove into the fray with a grin that suggested she just might be enjoying herself. "Hey, boys," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I hope you weren't planning on leaving without saying goodbye." The scavengers turned, surprise etched on their faces, and Thorn took full advantage, her shots precise and unrelenting. They were outmatched and unprepared, and it wasn't long before they were scrambling for the exits, their bravado shattered. With the immediate threat neutralized, Thorn raced to the command deck, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to stabilize the ship. The Misery groaned in protest, but its systems came alive beneath her touch, a testament to their shared resilience. "Come on, girl," she murmured. "We've got places to be." With a deft hand, she reconnected with Rick and Jax's pod, the comms crackling to life with their familiar voices. "Thorn, you there?" Rick's voice was a lifeline in the dark, filled with relief and disbelief. "Alive and kicking," Thorn replied, her grin widening. "I hope you boys are ready to rock and roll, cause we're not out of this yet." "What you have in mind, Cap?" Jax asked, his sarcasm a comforting constant. "Oh, you know," Thorn said, her tone light despite the tension. "Just a little rescue mission. Let's show these bastards what humans can do when we're backed into a corner." Rick and Jax exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of admiration and exasperation. Thorn's plans were always risky, usually bordering on suicidal, but they'd learned long ago to trust her instincts, even if it meant taking a leap of faith into the abyss. "All right," Rick said, his voice steady. "Let's get this show on the road. We've got an appointment with Destiny, and I don't want to be late." With a final keystroke, Thorn reoriented the Misery, plotting a course through the debris and chaos. The scavengers might have underestimated them, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. As the Misery surged forward, its engines roaring back to life, Thorn allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They'd escaped death, defied the odds, and perhaps most importantly, reminded the universe why you should never count a human out. "Let's make some noise," she said, her voice a battle cry in the void. "It's time to show them what we're made of." With that, the Misery plunged into the unknown, its path uncertain, its crew ready to face whatever came next. Stranded in a galaxy that rarely showed mercy, they'd learned to rely on each other, on their shared defiance and indomitable spirit. After all, they were human, and that was their greatest strength. Thorn leaned back in the Misery's captain chair, the weight of too many close calls pressing her down like an overzealous gravity field. The ship was a patchwork of jury-rigged systems, each one barely holding together, much like its captain and crew. But for now, it was flying, which was more than she could say for the scavengers currently floating away on pieces of what used to be their ship. "All right, kids," Thorne said into the comms, her voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could cut through steel. "Time to put my half-baked plan into action. Anyone got any last words before we go off the rails?" Jax's voice crackled over the line first, tinged with the kind of lazy confidence that suggested he was either unruffled or completely insane. "I always wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, so this seems like my kind of party," Rick chimed in, his tone a mixture of dry wit and reluctant admiration. "Just make sure you don't get us all killed, Cap. I've got a winning streak at cards I'd like to keep going." "Don't worry, Rick," Thorne replied. "I plan on living long enough to take all your money." Now let's focus on not becoming cosmic dust. Their target, the Interstellar Museum of Extinct Species. Their objective, create a diversion insane enough to rescue their captured teammate, while simultaneously exposing the Galactic Council's dirty laundry to everyone and their dog in the surrounding sectors. Thorne had always been ambitious, if nothing else. The Misery hurtled through space, a battered tank on its last legs but as determined as its pilot. Thorne's fingers danced across the controls, coaxing every iota of power from the creaking engines, while the rest of the crew prepared for the show. "Hey, Jax," Thorne called, her voice casual but edged with steel. "You remember where we put those fireworks, right? Next to Rick's stash of secret shame," Jax replied, a grin in his voice. "You know, the one labeled not porn, honest." "Hey, that's classified," Rick protested, but his voice was more amused than indignant. "Good," Thorne said, ignoring Rick's mock outrage. "Time to give the museum a light show they'll never forget." As the Misery approached the museum, Thorne flicked a switch, activating the ship's old but functional cloaking system. It was the kind of technology that would only fool the museum's ancient censors, but right now, that was all they needed. "All right, team," Thorne announced, her voice filled with the kind of grim determination that only came before a truly terrible idea. "Let's make history, or at least give the museum something to talk about." She flipped the comms to an open channel, broadcasting on every frequency she could access, letting the universe know they were here and they meant business. "Attention all museum staff and esteemed patrons," Thorne said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is Captain Thorne of the Misery. You might want to step outside for an impromptu light show. We'll be dancing with lasers and a bit of chaos, so grab your popcorn and enjoy the spectacle." She cut off the transmission, giving just enough time for word to spread without giving security a chance to lock down the place. The Misery swooped closer, its cargo hold doors yawning open to reveal an arsenal of old-world fireworks, artifacts from Earth that had no business being anywhere near combustible material. "Fire in the hole," Jax called, his voice tinged with glee as he pressed the button. The fireworks shot out from the Misery, painting the void with colors that defied logic and reason, a cacophony of light and sound that would have made even the most jaded pyrotechnician weep with envy. The museum's ancient systems went into high alert, alarms blaring as the fireworks reflected off the hulls of the preserved relics orbiting the building. Thorne grinned, knowing full well the chaos she'd just unleashed, and counting on it to cover their move. "Right, distractions up," Rick said, eyeing the chaos on the ship's monitors. "Let's go get our girl." Thorne turned the Misery towards the museum's auxiliary bay, the ship slipping through the chaos like a shadow. The bay was as old and forgotten as the rest of the museum's tech, which worked in their favor. The doors opened with barely a whisper of protest, welcoming the ship into its rusting embrace. Once docked, Thorne led the charge, her blaster ready and her crew close behind. The museum's corridors stretched out before them, dark and silent, the dusty remnants of forgotten exhibits watching their passage with empty eyes. "So," Jack said, glancing around, "any idea where they might be keeping our friend?" Rick consulted his handheld scanner, the flickering screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Security's likely got her in the archives. That's where they keep all the sensitive stuff. And you know, the things they don't want the public to see." Well, isn't that convenient? Thorn muttered, leading them deeper into the labyrinthine halls. Let's hope she's in a chatting mood when we get there. The journey through the museum was a tense affair, punctuated by the distant sounds of panicked guests and staff reacting to Thorn's fireworks display. They moved quickly, shadows among shadows, their path lit only by the occasional emergency light flickering to life. Finally, they reached the archives, a heavy door sealed with a lock that looked like it hadn't been updated since the last century. Rick stepped forward, his fingers working with the deftness of someone who'd been picking locks since before he could walk. "Piece of cake," Rick said, the door letting out a reluctant groan as it slid open. Inside, the archives were a stark contrast to the museum's public areas. No bells and whistles or polished displays here, just rows upon rows of shelves filled with relics and secrets, the air thick with dust and forgotten history. "All right," Thorn said, scanning the room for any sign of their missing crew member. "Let's find her and get out before someone decides to make us a permanent exhibit." As they moved through the archives, Thorn's resolve hardened. She'd seen enough of the Galactic Council's dealings to know they wouldn't play fair. Whatever lay ahead, they'd handle it together, or not at all. The archives were a maze of shadows and half-remembered history, each corner potentially hiding either salvation or a trap. And at the heart of it, Thorn could feel the pull of something wrong, something that didn't belong. Finally, they found her, or rather, she found them. A familiar voice called out from the depths of the archives, tinged with the kind of sarcasm only born of desperation. "About time you showed up," said a voice that was all fire and flint. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about little old me." Thorn turned, her grin fierce and unyielding as she saw their missing crew member, tied up but very much alive. "Us? Forget you? Never. Come on, let's get you out of here." As they freed her, the museum's security systems finally caught up with them, alarms blaring and red lights bathing the archives in an unholy glow. Thorn cursed under her breath, the brief window of opportunity slamming shut as the sound of boots echoed in the corridors. "Looks like they've rolled out the welcome wagon," Jack said dryly, his blaster raised and ready. Rick nodded, his face set with determination. "We need to make our exit and fast." "And how do we do that?" their rescued comrade asked, rubbing her wrists and flexing her fingers. "Preferably without getting ourselves shot." Thorn's mind raced, weighing their options. Brute force wasn't an option, not with their limited firepower and the museum's security closing in. They needed something more subtle, a way to slip through the cracks one last time. "All right," she said, pulling up the museum schematics on her handheld. "We don't need to fight them all. Just get to the docking bay and the misery can do the rest." With a nod, the crew fell into formation, moving like a single, determined entity through the archives and back into the museum's twisted corridors. The sound of approaching guards grew ever closer, but they didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Finally, at the last turn before the docking bay, Thorn paused, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. "You all know what to do," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Let's show these bastards they messed with the wrong crew." With that, they burst into the docking bay, the misery waiting like an old warhorse ready for one last charge. They piled aboard, the ship's engines roaring to life as Thorn took the helm. "All right, hold on to your butts," Thorn said, her grin sharp and wild as she punched the engines. The misery shot forward, leaving the museum in their wake along with a trail of fireworks that still lingered in the void. As they hurtled into the black, the chaos of the museum faded away, leaving only the vastness of space stretching before them, and the knowledge that they'd pulled off the impossible yet again. Their comrade, finally free, took a seat next to Thorn, her expression a mix of gratitude and amusement. "I knew you couldn't resist a good rescue mission." Thorn shrugged, her eyes on the stars. "Well, you know me, always up for a challenge." And as they sailed into the unknown, a band of misfits against the galaxy, there was a sense of triumph among them, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of space, humanity's spirit could still shine bright. For now, the battle was won, but the war was far from over. and Thorn knew they'd be ready for whatever came next. After all, they'd made a career out of doing the impossible. The Misery's engines hummed with a discontent that matched Thorn's mood as they streaked away from the museum, swathed in the cold embrace of space. The escape had been too close for comfort, the kind that leaves you wondering if you've just spent the last of your luck like a drunk gambler with his last credit. Well, that was a delightful little jaunt into the jaws of catastrophe, Rick remarked, sprawled in his chair like a cat that had spent all day napping and still wanted more sleep. Speak for yourself, Jax piped up from his station. I was starting to miss the smell of burnt ozone and old socks. It's comforting. Glad to see you both appreciate the ambience, Thorn said, twisting in her seat to glance at their newly rescued crew member Maya. Welcome back to the Misery, where hopes come to die and dreams go to be mocked. Maya shot her a wry smile, rubbing her wrists as if the memory of the ropes was still fresh. I was beginning to wonder if you'd leave me to join the exhibits. Not a chance, Thorn said, with a grin that showed more teeth than necessary. We might be a collection of the galaxy's finest idiots, but we don't leave our own behind. Now, let's see what the hell all this was for. Rick threw a switch, and the ship's interior lights dimmed as the main display flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a ghostly glow that made everyone look like they'd just crawled out of a horror holofilm. The screen filled with data streams, security logs, and enough encrypted Galactic Council secrets to make them the most wanted people this side of the asteroid belt. Well, Jax drawled, leaning back with an air of lazy satisfaction, looks like we've got the full unabridged version of the Council's greatest hits. Wonder if they'll autograph it for us, Maya said, her voice laced with irony. Rick leaned forward, his fingers dancing over the controls. Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. Project Clean Slate, that sounds ominous. Apparently they were planning to wipe Earth clean and start over. Something about correcting a long-standing administrative oversight. Jack snorted. Yeah, because genocide is just a bureaucratic hiccup, right? Thorn's eyes narrowed, her fingers clenching around the armrest. So, they're not only corrupt but subtle as a brick through a viewport. Typical, and this, Rick continued, is where they plan to pin it on a rival faction, escalating a nice little interstellar war. You know, as you do. Well, isn't that just the icing on the death cake? Maya said, crossing her arms. Do they have a contingency plan for if the whole galaxy decides they're a bunch of murderous twats? A moment of silence followed, heavy with the weight of the knowledge they now held. Then Thorn let out a long breath, her mind racing. We need to get this out. If the galaxy knows, the Council won't have the cover to pull this off. Rick nodded, his usual humor replaced by a seriousness that was rare for him. Agreed. But first, we've got to deal with the fact that every Council ship with a working engine is probably heading our way right now. Nothing like being popular, Jax quipped, though his eyes betrayed a sharpness that suggested his mind was already on the next move. Thorn set her jaw, her fingers ghosting over the controls as she plotted a course. All right, folks, we're heading to Free Station 9. It's on the fringe, and if there's anywhere we can find allies, or at least somewhere to broadcast this mess before we get blown out of the sky, it'll be there. Free Station 9, Mayor raised an eyebrow. Isn't that the place that makes the Wild West look like a Sunday picnic? Exactly, Thorn replied, a glint of defiance in her eyes. Desperate times, desperate measures. The Misery angled towards the distant stars, the engines thrumming with a familiar rhythm that resonated through the ship like a heartbeat. Behind them, the museum was a fading memory, its secrets now a burden they couldn't afford to keep to themselves. As they hurtled through the void, the crew fell into a tense anticipation, a silence only broken by the occasional snort or derisive comment. It was Thorn who finally spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. All right, folks, here's the plan. We hit Free Station 9, get this out to the networks, and then vanish before the Council can catch up with us. Everyone clear, clear as a mudslide, Jax said, his tone light but his gaze serious. Maya nodded, her expression set with determination. Let's make sure this batch of bad decisions counts for something. Rick gave a thumbs up, his eyes on the console as he monitored their approach vector. Let's just hope Free Station 9 is still standing by the time we get there. The misery surged onward, a fragile hope in the vastness of space. As the stars streaked past, they carried their cargo of secrets and a determination that burned brighter than the distant suns. It wasn't long before the silhouette of Free Station 9 loomed ahead, a dark shape against the starlit backdrop. It was a hodgepodge of old wrecks and newer constructions, a testament to the creativity and insanity of those who called such places home. Looks like a junkyard threw up, Maya observed, peering out the viewport. Home sweet home, Thorn quipped, bringing the ship in for a landing that was more of a controlled crash than a graceful descent. The misery shuddered as it settled onto the deck, and for a moment Thorn thought she heard a metallic groan that seemed to come from the ship's very soul. "All right, team," she said, unclipping her harness and standing with a stretch that cracked her spine. "Let's do this." The station was as chaotic as its reputation suggested. The corridors were a riot of activity, filled with every manner of being that the galaxy could throw together. It was a place where rules were more guidelines and where the best defense was an even better offense. They pushed through the crowds, keeping a low profile, well, as low as a group with a reputation like theirs could manage. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Rick led the way to a small comms hub tucked into a corner of the station. It was run by a grizzled old cyborg named Mag, who had more mechanical parts than organic ones, and a penchant for playing both sides whenever possible. "Mag," Rick greeted with a nod. "We need your help." Mag's eyes, one a glowing electronic blue, flicked over the group, assessing them with the kind of shrewdness that comes from a lifetime of dubious dealings. "Help ain't cheap, boys and girls. And you lot look like trouble wrapped in more trouble. Trouble's what we're good at," Jax chimed in with a grin that was more wolf than human. Thorn stepped forward, her voice steady and serious. "We've got something that can bring down the council, but we need to get it out there before they catch up to us. You in?" Mag scratched at a metal plate on his cheek, considering. "Council's been making life harder for folks like me. Could be worth my while, if the price is right. We've got credits," Maya offered, "and enough leverage to make your life a lot more interesting." Mag snorted, a sound that was half derision, half amusement. "Everything's interesting around here, sweetheart. But all right, let's see what you've got." Rick pulled out a data chip, holding it up like a talisman. "This is everything. Evidence of their schemes, their plans to wipe out entire populations. Enough to make even the most jaded media outlets sit up and notice." Mag took the chip, slotting it into a reader integrated into his arm. His electronic eye flickered as he scanned the data, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well, well, well," he murmured. "This is some prime stuff, kiddos. All right, you got yourself a deal. I'll get this out on the networks faster than a politician can lie. Faster than that, we hope," Thorn said dryly. "And if you double-cross us," Mag held up a hand, the metal joints clicking, "no need for threats. I'm in this for the long game, and you lot just became my best investment." With the deal set, the crew retreated to a nearby cantina, a place that was as much a bar as it was an armory. They settled at a table, drinks in hand, the weight of the universe temporarily lifted from their shoulders. "Think it'll work?" Maya asked, nursing a drink that smelled like it could strip paint. "It has to," Thorn replied, though the doubt was hard to shake. "We've done our part, now we see if the galaxy cares enough to do theirs. And if they don't?" Jax asked, his tone light but his gaze deadly serious. Thorn shrugged, a smirk playing on her lips. "Then we keep making noise until someone listens, or until the council decides we're not worth the trouble." Rick raised his glass, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "To making noise, then." The rest of the crew followed suit, their glasses clinking in a toast to their reckless plan, to their stubborn defiance, to their refusal to let the galaxy grind them down. As they sat there, surrounded by the chaos of Free Station 9, There was a sense of camaraderie that went beyond simple friendship, a bond forged in the fires of shared adversity, tempered by their shared irreverence for the powers that be. "Well," Maya said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh, "if nothing else, at least we got a good story out of it." "And isn't that what it's all about?" Thorn replied, a grin spreading across her face. "Will be legends or warnings. Either way, we'll be remembered." Laughter and banter filled the space between them, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was always room for hope and for a little bit of mischief. And so, as the universe spun on, indifferent and uncaring, a small group of humans sat around a table, a ragtag crew with nothing to lose and everything to gain. They knew the fight was far from over, but for now, they were content to raise their glasses and defy the cosmos with all the irreverence they could muster. Because in the end, the only real victory is to laugh in the face of the inevitable, and to know that, at least for today, they had won.